Hello, today is Wednesday, March 16th, which means that we had our final class for GB 3070 2 days ago on Monday, the 14th. And it also means that yesterday, on the 15th, your final two chapter problem sets were due on Applia. This was for chapter 33, which you see in front of you, and chapter 34. As promised, I'm going to go over, there was one question in chapter 33 problem set and two in chapter 34, for which the average score in the class was below my threshold of 85%, which suggests that it's worthwhile to specifically address those questions. Of course, Applia gives you its own answers to those questions and explanations, but those aren't always sufficient, and when a fair number of students have struggled with the question, it's worth my time, I believe, to go over that. Now, that said, we don't have another class meeting, so therefore I have to record this and post this video. At the same time, you have final exams, and you have I hesitate to say final exam in this course because it's not cumulative, but the macroeconomic exam in this course is available for you to do and to take right now. It's due on Tuesday, next Tuesday evening, Tuesday at 10 p.m. But in the interest of time, I didn't want to create the slides that I usually do. So what I'm going to do is, you see slides in front of you here. What I did is I just picked out the slide. I've highlighted the questions that were problematic in Applia. On those two problem sets, 3 problems from those 2 problem sets, and I've got a shortened set of slides that relate to the questions that were problematic, and so I'll go back and forth between the slides and the Applia problems themselves. So here was the first Applia problem. There was one question, actually, sorry, this one. There was one question. It was the only question on the problem set on chapter 33, which is on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and it was question 8, and the topic was short-run economic fluctuation and long-run adjustment. See that topic right there. And so here was the question it's asking. And I will come back to it. I just want to sort of get the basic idea of it, then we'll go to the slide. So the following graph shows the economy in the long-run equilibrium at the expected price of 120. So we see this here at the expected price. Again, expected price level, highlight that, of 120, and the natural rate of output of $600 billion. Suppose firms become pessimistic about future business conditions and cut back on investment spending. Right? Shift the short-run aggregate supply curve or the short-run aggregate demand curve to show the short-run impact of the business pessimism. Okay, and then it's going to then ask us in the short run, basically to translate what's happened here. And then it's going to ask us how the economy adjusts in the long run, right? So we're going to then graph and show the long run impact and sort of what sort of adjusts after that. So let me go to our slides that we have on this topic and sort of summarize. These are slides we've already seen, so there's nothing new here, but to summarize what we have on that particular topic, and then we'll go back to the question and see what we think their answers are and why. So remember, this was we're going to just look at a couple slides, or a few slides from this chapter, set of slides on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. First, remember the general idea of this model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply, which is, of course, presented there in that question itself. We're talking about, of course, the axes are the price level and the real output. Prices and quantity. Quantity in this case is the real GDP or our output. And we discussed how the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping, the aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, the short-run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, and that the model defines the equilibrium price level and equilibrium output, right? So that the price level in the economy adjusts to equate the quantity of goods and services supplied in the short run and the quantity of goods and services demanded in the short run. Right? So that's our model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Now, for this particular question that we have, it's important to understand a bit about aggregate demand. We talked about the slope of aggregate demand. Don't need to review that for this question, but we do need to talk about aggregate demand curve shifts. Right? So this is the slide that I presented to you about aggregate demand curve shifts, and it said the following. So I said, look, any event, remember aggregate demand has 4 components: consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So any event that changes any of those, right, other than price, right, except the change in price. The change in price is reflected by movement along this curve. But any other change that affects any of the components of aggregate demand, right, will shift the aggregate demand curve. Right? For example, a stock market boom will make households feel wealthier, so consumption rises, right, and the aggregate demand curve shifts right. And so that was what, so the first part of our question, so this is about the idea that, again, so this, to summarize what this is saying, anything that changes any of these components, consumption, investment, government expenditures, or net exports, except the change in price will shift the aggregate demand curve. Right? And obviously a positive, something that increases one of those will shift the curve to the right, something that decreases one of those will shift the curve to the left. Right? So let's go back to our question here. So our scenario is, so we start off with this situation here. Right? This is our, we're at a long-run equilibrium, it says. Expected price level of 120, natural rate of output of 600 billion. Suppose firms become pessimistic about future business conditions and cut back on investment spending. Okay. Well, when you cut back on investment spending, right? Well, again, that is, investment is one of the components of aggregate demand. Consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. Okay? So what we have is to shift the short-run aggregate supply curve or the short-run aggregate demand curve to show the short-run impact of the business pessimism. Right? And so this is not going, and it's not going to affect the aggregate supply. Certainly in the short run, it could, potentially lower investment, could reduce output in the long run. But in the short run, what we're talking about is the initial decrease in investment. Right? Investment, by definition, is spending now for future, production. Right? And so it can't shift the short-run aggregate supply curve, but it does shift the short-run aggregate demand curve. Right? It's one of the components of aggregate demand is investment, and we're talking about again that says they cut back on investment spending. So reduction in investment, or reduction in any of the components of aggregate demand is going to shift the aggregate demand curve to the left or down. Right? And so we've got to have it. So the first thing is to simply shift the aggregate demand curve to the left. Right? And so it then says, in the short run, the decrease in investment spending associated with business pessimism, right, caused the price level to, okay, well, remember the expected price level was 120, the natural rate of output was 600. The new price level, when aggregate demand curve shifts, is below 120. So in the short run, the decrease in investment spending associated with business pessimism caused the price level to fall below the price level people expected, and the quantity of output, right, the natural rate of output is 600, right, and so once we have this reduction in investment, the actual rate of output is less than that. So the quantity of output to, again, fall below the natural rate of output. The business pessimism will cause the unemployment rate to, okay, so again, so price goes down, output goes down. Right? Well, when output goes down, what happens to unemployment? The business pessimism will cause unemployment rate to, right? Well, when output goes down, unemployment rate goes up. Right? And remember, when we're at the natural rate of output, we are also at the natural rate of unemployment. So we were at $600 billion, that the question said that's the long run natural rate of output, then we're also at the natural rate of unemployment. So therefore, when output falls below that, right, when the economy slows down, people lose their jobs, unemployment goes up. So the business pessimism will cause the unemployment rate to rise above the natural rate of unemployment in the short run. Right? And say, all right, so then now, hopefully that's clear, right? That's pretty simple. Now it's saying, we get the question again, the following graph shows the economy in long-run equilibrium with the expected price level of 120, the natural rate of output of 600 billion, before the decrease in investment spending associated with business pessimism. It's just saying that, look, here we got the same graph as before. Nothing's different. Exact same graph as before, right? And then it's asking us what's going to happen during the transition from the short run to the long run. Price level expectations what's going to happen to price level expectations, and what's going to happen to, in the short run, either aggregate demand or aggregate supply curve will shift in which direction. So what's going to happen as we move from the short run to the long run, right? And then it says, now show the long-run impact of the business pessimism by shifting both the short-run aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve to the appropriate positions. Okay. Well, and again, and I gave you a note at the beginning, by the way, here, right? Which is always in smaller text. I'm not sure why, but I noted, among other things, recognize that whatever shift you made in the, I might as well read it all. Note in the first graph below, you're asked to shift either the short-run aggregate supply curve or the short-run aggregate demand curve to reflect a scenario in which firms cut back on investment spending. Hint, is investment spending a component of aggregate demand or aggregate supply? It's a component of aggregate demand. In the second graph below, representing the long run, you were asked to, quote, show the long-run impact of the business pessimism and decrease in investment spending by shifting both the short-run aggregate supply curve short-run aggregate demand curve and the short-run aggregate supply curve to the appropriate positions. Right? And I emphasized the word both, which wasn't, it's not bold in the original, but I I all capped it here so you understand. So then we'll recognize that whatever shift you made in the first short-run graph should also be included in the second long-run graph. So the only new element is for you to show how the other curve shifts to adjust to update price expectations in the long run. Okay. long story short, look, in this first, we already said that a reduction in investment spending shifts the aggregate demand curve to the left or down. So it's saying, look, here, go ahead and repeat that shift, right? And now tell me what's going to happen in the long run. As we transition, actually, as they said, during the transition from the short run to the long run, what's going to happen here? Yeah, well, let's go back to our slides. Let's see, where are those? Here, from that chapter. And so let's now look at a selection of a couple of slides, or I'm not even sure if it's maybe only one slide, on the shifts in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Right? And remember, actually, a couple slides here. So remember, I talked about, first of all, that the idea is that economic fluctuations are caused by events that shift the aggregate demand and or aggregate supply curves. And talk about the 4 steps to analyzing economic fluctuations. Determine whether the event shifts aggregate demand or aggregate supply. We already said that the reduction in business investment was going to shift aggregate demand curve. Right? Determine whether the curve shifts left to right. Well, we said it shifts to the left. Right? Use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram to see how the shift changes output and prices in the short run. Well, we said it reduces output and lowers prices in the short run. And then now the 4th element is use the aggregate demand and aggregate supply diagram to see how the economy moves from the new short run equilibrium to the new long run equilibrium. And I gave you several examples, but I'm going to highlight one that is akin or similar to the one we have here. Right? So first we start off here. This is before, anything happens. This is before the reduction in investment spending or anything like that. And so we're at a long run equilibrium. There you see the long run aggregate supply curve at the natural rate of production. The prices are at their expected level. We're at point A, upward sloping short run aggregate supply, downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Right? And suppose we have an adverse aggregate demand shift. Right? In this case, in this example that we gave in class, was stock market crash, right, which was affecting consumption, right, and therefore the aggregate demand curve, consumption being a component of aggregate demand. And the example is that was consumption falls, so aggregate demand shifts left. Now in our problem for an amplia, of course, it's investment that falls. Aggregate demand is still shifting to left, but investment has fallen. Right? So investment has fallen, but either way, it's the same as the example here I gave in class, which is the aggregate demand curve shifts to left. Right? So therefore, the short run equilibrium is going to be at point B, with prices and output lower, unemployment up. Right? This is so far, this is exactly the question we've done so far. Now the question is what happens in the long run. And so we said is over time, the expected prices falls. Right? Short run aggregate supply shifts right until the long run equilibrium, we get to a long run equilibrium at point C here, right? Where output and unemployment are back at their initial levels, right? So again, what is this saying? Is that, look, the reason the short run aggregate supply curve is downward sloping, remember, there's 3 reasons. The sticky price theory, the sticky wage theory, and the misperceptions theory, right? All based on prices being different from what expected. And the fact that prices can't fully adjust, right? We don't go from point A to point C, which would mean we have no change in output and just a reduction in prices. That can't happen immediately because prices and wages are sticky, and there's misperceptions about changes in prices. Instead, we move along the short run aggregate supply curve, and move from point A to point B. Prices do go down a bit, but they don't fully absorb, what's happened here, right? And instead, but then over time, the prices that are sticky become unsticky, wages become unsticky, misperceptions are corrected, right? We now understand that prices are going to be lower, therefore wages are lowered. Right? Perceptions are adjusted, right? And the short run aggregate supply shifts down, right? Costs to the right. Costs, we adjust our wages lower, therefore our costs are lower, therefore we can produce more at any given price level, right? Or the cost of any level of production is lower. And so the short run aggregate supply curve responds as we transition from the short run to the long run by shifting to the right? Again, so the short run aggregate supply curve is going to shift and move us from point B to point C. All right? And so if we go back to our question here then, so during the transition from the short run to the long run, price level expectations will, right? Well, we see again, that the price level was expected to be 120, aggregate demand has shifted left, right? So now prices have gone down. We're going to adjust downward, right? We're going to now the whole point of the movement along the short run aggregate supply curve was that prices weren't what expected. But when we over time, the price expectations end up matching reality, right? Things get adjusted. So what happens is the price expectations adjust downward, and the short run aggregate supply curve, right, will shift to the right. Right? And so the short-run aggregate supply curve shifts to the right. Right? Exactly like the example we did in class. Right? And so again, what we have is we now shift the aggregate demand curve. Then that initially moves along the aggregate supply curve, but now the aggregate supply curve, as price expectations adjust, this aggregate supply curve shifts to the right, and we end up back at the natural rate of output, but at a lower price level. So it says in the long run, as a result of the business pessimism, the price level decreases, right? The quantity of output returns to the natural rate of output, and the unemployment rate, right, again, returns to the natural rate of unemployment. When we're at the natural rate of output, we are at the natural rate of unemployment, right, in the long run. Right? And so that was that question. That was the one question that was somewhat problematic from, this was chapter 33 on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Right? Well, we then have, there were a couple questions from the chapter 34 on the influence of monetary and fiscal policy on aggregate demand. And they were, thankfully, I guess, not graphing questions. They're question 8 and question 9, but we'll actually do question 9 first for pedagogical reasons. So this is the chapter 34, the influence of monetary and fiscal policy on aggregate demand. And question 9 was about the marginal propensity to consume, the multiplier effect, and crowding out. Right? So it asks us about, suppose economists observe an increase in government spending, what is the estimate of the marginal propensity to consume? If there's no crowding out, what if there is crowding out? And so again, it's telling us we have to learn about the multiplier, marginal propensity to consume, and crowding out. So let's go to our slides on that. Right? So we're talking about the latter part of the presentation I gave on this chapter 34 and the influence of fiscal policy. Right? Remember, fiscal policy is, of course, about spending and taxation, right? The government, for example, can stimulate the economy by either increasing spending or lowering taxes. And these, whether it's taxes or spending changes, they're impacted by the multiplier effect and the crowding out effect. Right? So, talk about the multiplier effect. What is the multiplier effect? Again, this is the idea. So here, remember, fiscal policy has two effects on aggregate demand. The multiplier effects tends to amplify the impact of any fiscal changes, whereas the crowding out effect tends to dampen the impact of any fiscal policy changes. So talk about the multiplier effect. What is this saying? And basically, remember, the multiplier effect, of course, is the idea that the government spends money. For example, this is fiscal policy. The government spends money in the economy. They buy $20 billion worth of planes from Boeing or aircraft equipment or whatever it might be. That money then ends up in workers' pockets or owners' pockets or stockholders' pockets, or then gets used for purchases of inputs for Boeing, which then the bottom line is the money ends up in people's pockets, right? And then they then spend some of that money. Right? And then that spending, of course, is consumption, initial consumption. So the multiplier effect example we gave is here a $20 billion increase in government expenditures initially shifts aggregate demand to the right by $20 billion. Right? So remember, aggregate demand is consumption, investment, government expenditures, and net exports. So if G goes up by 20 billion, then aggregate demand shifts to the right by 20 billion initially. Right? But then, right, that 20 billion ends up in the pockets of consumers who then consume. Right? And consumption, of course, is also another component of aggregate demand. So the higher income leads to an increase in consumption, which shifts aggregate demand further to the right. Right? And so the multiplier effect is about a amplification of the fiscal policy here in this example of spending the $20 billion. Right? How big is that? Well, it depends on the marginal propensity to consume. Right? How big is the multiplier effect? It depends on how much consumers respond to increases in income. Right? The marginal propensity to consume is the fraction of extra income that households direct towards consumption rather than savings. Right? So, for example, if the marginal propensity to consume is 0.8 and income rises by 100, consumption rises by 80. Right? And so the idea is the initial impact of the government expenditure is exactly equal to the amount of the government expenditure. But then that money gets spent again. Well, how much of it gets spent again? Right? Well, it depends on the marginal propensity to consume. So, again, NPC is the fraction of extra income consumed rather than saved. And here in our example, what's the impact on demand of a $20 billion increase in government purchases? Well, the initial impact in aggregate demand is, of course, an increase of $20 billion, right? But then that $20 billion ends up in consumers' pockets, and it gets spent. Not all of it. How much of it gets spent? Well, the answer is the MPC, whatever the marginal propensity to consume is, which is a fraction, right? Some fraction of that $20 billion. But then when they spend that also again ends up in, whatever consumers spend that on, that ends up in going to businesses, which ends up going to their workers or their owners or their stockholders or their suppliers. But bottom line, that amount also ends up in consumers' pockets, which then gets spent. How much of it gets spent? Well, we got to multiply it by the marginal propensity to consume again. So we take this MPC times 20 billion, multiply it by MPC again, right? And we get MPC squared times 20 billion. But that money again ends up in consumers' pockets, which then gets spent again. How much? Multiply by MPC, MPC cubed, in this, again, infinite sum here, right? So that the multiplier, right, the total is times 20 is 1 plus MPC squared plus MPC cubed plus, on to infinity, right, times the 20 billion. Right? And we've a few times in class gone over how we sort of figure out what that infinite sum is. It's called a geometric sum. And so it ends up being 1 over 1 minus MPC. And I won't now go over the math of that, but so for example, if the marginal propensity to consume is 3/4 or 3/4, meaning that people, out of every dollar of additional income that consumers get, they spend 75 cents of it, right? Then the multiplier is given by 1 over 1 minus 3/4 or 4. Right? In this case, in the example, a $20 billion increase in government spending generates $80 billion of increased demand for goods and services. And I want to highlight that because we're going to get to a question, I think it's question 8, right, where it talks about the impact of a $20 billion increase in government goods and services, and it happens to be that question even uses the MPC of 3/4 or 0.75, right? So what this is saying is, if the multiplier is 4, if the marginal propensity to consume is 3/4, and therefore the multiplier is 4, if the government spends $20 billion, it actually generates a shift in aggregate demand or an increased demand, total of $80 billion. So $20 billion becomes an $80 billion, $20 billion increase in government spending becomes an $80 billion increase in aggregate demand, right, when the MPC is 3 over 4. So now let's, the other effect, of course, is the crowding out effect, but I think before we get to that, let's answer this question in part. So it says, number 9 says, suppose the economists observe that an increase in government spending of $10 billion raises the total demand of goods and services by $30 billion. Right? If these economists ignore the possibility of crowding out, so good, we can ignore crowding out, so forget crowding out, we just have the multiplier effect, they would estimate the marginal propensity to consume to be, okay, well, if $10 billion in spending raises aggregate demand, total demand for goods and services by $30 billion, right, then the total impact is 3 times the initial spending. Therefore, our multiplier is 30 billion divided by 10 billion is 3. Our multiplier is 3. Well, you can do the math. If the multiplier is 3, going back to here, if the multiplier is 3, right, so 3, this is equal to 3, then 1 over that has to be 1/3. So so the idea is again that it means that 1 minus MPC must be 1/3. Right? That's how this becomes 3. Right? So 1 minus MPC must be 1/3. Therefore, MPC must be 2/3. Right? The marginal propensity to consume must be 2/3. So we go back here and we say, if these economists ignore the possibility of crowding out, they would estimate the marginal propensity to consume to be 2/3. Right? And so there's your answer to that first part. Now suppose economists allow for crowding out. Okay, well, hold on. What's crowding out? We got to go back to our slides here. What is the crowding out effect? Right? The crowding out effect, right, is going to dampen the impact of a fiscal change. Right? And the crowding out effect says fiscal policy has another effect in aggregate demand that works in the opposite direction. Right? So what happens is, of course, a fiscal expansion does increase aggregate demand, because of the initial spending and the multiplier effect. Right? But an increase in aggregate demand is going to increase money demand, right, which is going to raise the interest rate, reduce investment, and therefore reduce the net increase in aggregate demand. This is called the crowding out effect. Again, what's happening again is the idea is the government spends, increase aggregate demand, which increases money demand. Right? But we know that from our earlier in this chapter, we know that money demand and money supply in the short run are going to drive the interest rate. So that raises the interest rate. Right? When you raise the interest rate, that lowers investment. Well, investment is another component of aggregate demand. So government expenditures, yes, will increase G. government expenditures, the G part of aggregate demand will increase the C part of aggregate demand, consumption, right, because of the multiplier effect, but will reduce the I part of aggregate demand, which is investment. Right? That's called the crowding out effect. Now, therefore, whether or not the aggregate demand shift is larger or smaller than the initial fiscal expansion, right? The idea is it depends on whether the multiplier effect or the crowding effect is crowding out effect is larger, right? So the government spends 20 billion, right? If the multiplier effect is larger than crowding out effect, then the net impact on the economy would be greater than 20 billion. But if the crowding out effect is larger, the net impact on the economy would actually be less than 20 billion, right? But probably it might be, or it could be somewhere in between. But the point is, the full multiplier effect, we don't get the full multiplier because of the crowding out effect. And the example was as follows. I said, look, suppose there's a $20 billion increase in government spending, initially shifts aggregate demand right by 20 billion, right? That's the initial increase in G. But then, of course, because of that increases as this goes to the right, income goes from Y1 to Y2 to a total higher income, increases money demand, right? Well, when the money demand curve shifts, right? This is the short run where the money demand and money supply are going to be drive the interest rate. Right? Increase in money demand increases the interest rate. Well, you increase the interest rate, that's going to reduce investment. Well, when you reduce investment, right, what does that do? That reduces aggregate demand. So aggregate demand curve actually shifts back. You get an initial, you get an increase in government expenditures, a decrease in investment. What's the net effect? Right? And again, it'll depend on the magnitude of each of these effects. Right? All right, and so, but this allows us to go here and say, okay, now suppose the economists allow for crowding out. Right? So, if there was no crowding out, we said the marginal consumption must be 2/3. Right? Now suppose there is crowding out. Right. So now how their new estimate of the marginal consumption would be, smaller or larger than their initial one? Well, if there is crowding out, and we went from 10 billion to 30 billion, right? But there is crowding out, it must have meant that without crowding out, we would have been at maybe 40 billion, 50 billion, 60 billion, something larger, right? So absent crowding out, right, the multiplier effect has to be, right, the multiplier would have to be greater than 3. Without crowding out, we went from 10 to 30 because the multiplier was 3 and there was no crowding out. But if the multiplier is 3 and there is crowding out, we'd go from 10 to 30, because of the multiplier, but then we would reduce it, right, because of crowding out, right, because there'd be a reduction in investment. Therefore, the multiplier has to be greater than 3, right? Well, if the multiplier is greater than 3, right, so the idea is that the multiplier has to be, again, going back to this multiplier, whoa. If the multiplier is greater than 3, right, then that means that 1 minus, that means that, of course, 1 over 1 minus MPC has to be greater than 3, which means that 1 minus MPC has to be less than, 1 minus MPC has to be less than a third, right? Well, if this to be less than a third, then MPC has to be greater than 2/3, right? The point is, the multiplier has got to be larger. And just logically thinking, what that means is that if there's crowding out, consumption must have, so this is, remember what this means. This means there's been a $10 billion increase in government expenditures, but the total demand went up to 30 billion, which means there was absent crowding out, it would mean there was a $20 billion increase in consumption. Right? But with crowding out, then there was a negative impact on investment. So the total increase in consumption would have to be more than the 30 minus 10 or more than the 20 billion, right? Which would mean that consumers spent more of that money, more of that initial $10 billion of government spending, which means logically speaking, the marginal propensity to consume has to be higher, right? Mathematically, if you do the math, you can figure it out, but just logically speaking, right? The impact on consumption must have been greater than, we have $10 billion added to aggregate demand from government expenditures. The amount that's added to consumption must be greater than the 20 billion because we had a reduction in aggregate demand because of crowding out. Therefore, the new estimate of marginal propensity to consume has to be larger than their initial one. And so that was question 9 on chapter 34. The last question we're going to cover then is actually the previous question, question 8, right? And so this is about changes in taxes versus changes in government purchases. Right? The book doesn't say too much about taxes, and I didn't say too much about taxes. Let me actually show you the slides that we talked about in taxes, and this is pretty much all the book says as well about it, right? But just understanding, let's go to that, about changes in taxes of fiscal policy, right? That a tax cut, of course, increases your take-home pay. Households respond by spending a portion of this extra income, shifting aggregate demand to the right. Well, what portion do they spend? We know they spend the marginal product MPC, the marginal propensity to consume. So when you lower taxes by, $20 billion, right, you increase consumption by how much? Not by 20 billion, but the portion of that consumers spend, which is the MPC times 20 billion, right? But the aggregate demand curve does shift to the right. How big of that size of the shift is also affected by the multiplier and crowding out effects, right? And then I mentioned, although not relevant for this question, whether households perceive the tax cut to be temporary or permanent. But the important point here is that when you reduce taxes, right, households, that increases aggregate demand by increasing consumption, but households do not spend all of that increased income, right, from a tax cut. They only spend a portion of it determined by the marginal propensity to consume. So if we go back here, it says, suppose the government reduces taxes by 20 billion. There's no crowding out. Good, we can forget about crowding out. And the marginal propensity to consume is 3/4. Well, the initial effect of the tax reduction is a blank $1 billion increase or decrease in, well, clearly it's going to be an increase in aggregate demand, right? They cut taxes, so that's going to increase aggregate demand. Right? They're not talking about cutting government spending. Notice they're just cutting taxes, right? So government spending is staying the same as far but they've cut taxes, which is going to increase consumption. How much is it going to increase consumption? Well, consumers have $20 billion more of income than they had before. How much do they spend? Well, they spend 3/4 of it, right? That's the marginal propensity to consume. So 3/4 of 20 billion is, of course, 15 billion. Right? And so the answer to that first part is a $15 billion increase in aggregate demand. Right? All right, so the initial shift, right? So going back to, right, if we go back to, I'm going to go back to this slide here. So now, unlike the $20 billion, I'll go to this one here. Here we had government spending increase to 20 billion, which has, so the initial impact, the initial shift to aggregate demand was 20 billion because it was directly going to aggregate demand, which is government expenditure. Now the initial impact, cutting taxes doesn't directly increase aggregate demand. It only does so through taxation. Through consumption. Therefore, the initial impact, right, on aggregate demand was 15 billion. But again, that 15 billion then gets spent again, right? And so we again have to deal with our multiplier, right? So it gets multiplied. That 15 billion goes into people's pockets, and again, part of it is spent. Right? So we go back to our multiplier formula here. So the total effect of the tax cut in aggregate demand is a what? Well, if the MPC is 3/4, right, then 1 minus 3/4 is 1/4. 1 over 1/4 is 4. So look, it's right here, right? The multiplier is 4, right? So the initial effect is 15 billion, but then it gets multiplied by the multiplier. The total effects of the tax cut aggregate demand is again, it's going to be a increase in aggregate demand. How much? Well, the multiplier is 4. 4 times 15, 60. $60 billion increase, right? Because the $15 billion gets spent. So remember, a tax decrease of 20 billion doesn't translate into an initial shift in aggregate demand of 20 billion because it only shifts it through consumption. So, but then that gets multiplied. So it's $60 billion increase. Now the total effect of this 20 billion tax cut is less than or greater than the total effect that a $20 billion increase in government purchases would be. Well, conveniently enough, look, with the multiplier of 4, a $20 billion increase in government spending generates $80 billion of increased demand for goods and services. Well, so therefore, the tax cut of 20 billion, total effect of this 20 billion tax cut is less than the total effect that a $20 billion increase in government purchases would be. So because, again, government purchases, if you spend 20 billion, it goes right into aggregate demand. It doesn't get dampened or didn't get reduced by the marginal propensity to consume. It goes right into aggregate demand, right? So here's a question: how could the government increase aggregate demand without changing the government's budget deficit? Well, look, here we have it. If you reduce taxes by 20 billion, increase spending by 20 billion, you haven't changed the deficit, right? But one is going to reduce aggregate, the $20 billion increase in government spending we just saw would be a $80 billion increase in aggregate demand, whereas if you increase taxes by that amount, right, you would only reduce aggregate demand by 60 billion. So what it's saying is, look, how could the government increase aggregate without changing the government's budget deficit? Well, if they increase spending and taxes by the same amount, right? If you increase taxes and government purchases by the same amount, right? The impact on aggregate demand of the increase in government purchases will be larger than the impact on aggregate demand of increased taxes. Okay? And so this is a way that the government can increase aggregate demand without changing the government's budget deficit. And so that's the answer to question 8. Right? Well, I hope that is helpful. Again, these are the last questions from the last 2 problem sets that seem somewhat problematic. So I hope this is helpful both in your understanding of these concepts of aggregate demand and the influence of monetary and fiscal policy on aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and also helpful, of course, in your efforts on the final exam or the exam we have in macroeconomics. Thank you very much.